please welcome our panel of Power Dykes, Frances Stevens, publisher and editor-in-chief of Deneuve, the hottest lesbian magazine.
There wasn't a glossy magazine for lesbians anywhere.
She decided, I'm gonna make one. That's total rock and roll.
I love my job. I love my job. I love my job.
Whoever was in Curve, like that was it. That's how you knew what was going on.
Like the latest musicians,
like,
the latest artists.
Yeah.
It was very hard to be out and open in the late 80s.
I think we should do away with gays if possible.
We did not see ourselves represented in any positive mainstream way.
I was the one that was supposed to start this magazine.
She got the idea and then she's just like, oh my God, I need money.
So I just applied for a bunch of credit cards all on the same day. I just cashed them all in.
And there they come.
My horses came in first and second. At the end of the day, I had enough money to start the magazine.
You know what the difference is between parsley and pussy?
What, Franco?
I don't know. I don't eat parsley.
When the magazine put me on the cover, it allowed women in our own community to see a well-spoken, funny, intelligent, charming, gentlemanly butch, which is basically who I am, unless you cross my path.
Just the power of seeing me.
In the last 24 hours, I heard this thing that I never wanted to hear, that the magazine could be coming to an end.
We live in a systemic, racist, sexist, anti-LGBTQ world, and we have to fight it every day.
We want the place at the table we deserve.
Visibility looks like us being able to be the authors of our own experience.
Every time we put out a magazine, it felt groundbreaking.
What's happening here right now is Franco's legacy.
Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited to be in the company of such an incredibly brilliant group of people. I say this with no exaggeration. I'm very excited about tonight. My name's Imani Rupert Gordon. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm the executive director for the National Center for Lesbian Rights. Tonight is going to be a fabulous discussion. Before this week, I had attended exactly one in-person event in my role at NCLR. It was a drive-in movie to see Ahead of the Curve. And I told Jen and Franco how much the movie meant to me. See, before I worked in movement, I was a queer woman that longed to see myself represented. Seeing characters on a screen where I could think, maybe she was a bit like me. Seeing pages of people that love like I do. An important part of equity is representation. To live our full and authentic lives, we need and deserve to see our experiences and our stories told. We need to celebrate the uniqueness of who we are. And that's why this panel and this partnership coming together is so important, because that's what these amazing people are doing. Because at the heart of the work of the Ms. Foundation, the original reason to start Curve Magazine and the necessity for the National Center for Lesbian Rights all starts at the same place: representation and meeting the needs of those that have been left out. Kimberly Crenshaw calls this intersectionality. If we aren't doing the work to center the most underrepresented groups, then by design, these people will fall through the cracks. Usually when we talk about intersectionality, we hear something like, when you have multiple marginalized identities, it's hard. But that's not what it means, not in any real way. Intersectionality is talking about the systems, the structures, and the institutions that create very different realities for people with multiple underrepresented identities. And this happens when the most underrepresented communities were not considered. Kimberly Crenshaw coined this term when Emma DeGraff Reed didn't get the protection that she needed after she faced racism and sexism simultaneously. Not because employment protections weren't available, but because the judge didn't know that you could experience them both at the same time. And he, as luck would have it, had never experienced either. NCLR was started because the needs of women weren't considered in what was then known as the gay rights movement because of the regular run-of-the-mill sexism. And then the needs of LGBTQ women weren't considered in the women's rights movement because of our sexual orientation or our identities as women. NCLR filled a gap and created a family law program that makes all families stronger and safer. The work of NCLR considers everyone in our community. And philanthropy is an institution hasn't largely centered women, and certainly not women of color. But look at what the Ms. Foundation is doing, centering the experiences of women, trans, and non-binary folks. And by prioritizing the needs of Black women and girls, what do we see? That everyone is stronger for this. And in this amazing film, Ahead of the Curve, we see these exact dynamics play out. We see the importance of telling our stories and preserving our history. They explore the language and why representation matters. And I think we can all see a little bit of ourselves in there. And so this is what we mean when we talk about intersectionality. And this is why I'm so excited to have this conversation with this group of people. We're in for a phenomenal evening. And lastly, this event is full circle for me because on the night that I was at the drive-in just about a year ago was the first time I met Ruth in real life as well. And we stood talking 6 feet apart, and our wives stood talking 6 feet apart. And if I can just say, Ruth, I think we just really liked each other. And since then, I've been able to see that she's more than a kind person. She's fierce, and she's smart, and she's an inspiration. And Ruth McFarland is the Vice President of Advancement for Ms. Foundation. Most recently, Ruth served as the Director of Development and Community Engagement at the National Center for Lesbian Rights and the Director of Programs at the San Francisco LGBTQ Community Center. Prior to working in the nonprofit sector, Ruth practiced law as an associate at Norton Rose Fulbright in Dallas and at Linklater's in New York. And this is the kind of magic that will be moderating this panel tonight. Ruth, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely thrilled. Oh, I'm unmuted. Troubles can start. Amani, thank you so much for that incredible introduction. I am thrilled to be here. I'm so excited to be here. It is obviously in many ways for me a homecoming. So that's exciting with respect to NCLR. And it's a homecoming with respect to Curve too. Like many, many, many lesbians out there, I have a Curve story. So thrilled to be here with you all. Happy Pride, everyone. Happy Pride to everyone in the audience. And I'm going to quickly introduce the others on the panel. We have with us Tamika Butler. Tamika is a national expert and speaker on issues related to the built environment, equity, anti-racism, diversity and inclusion, organizational behavior, and change management. She is the principal and founder of Tamika L. Butler Consulting, where she focuses on inequality, inequity, and social justice. She's also a former co-chair of the NCLR board and a dear friend. And so thrilled to see you, Tamika. Happy to be here with you this evening. Kathy Sakamura is the deputy director and director of the family law program at NCLR. In her I don't even know how you wear all the hats, Kathy. I have never understood how you wear all the hats. But in her extraordinary work over many, many, many years at NCLR, she has founded NCLR's Family Protection Program, which improves access to family law services for low-income LGBTQ parents and their children, with a focus on increasing services to families of color. And it's exciting just under your leadership to see, Kathy, where the project that really is the origin story of NCLR has gone and how it's grown over the years. And so thank you for the work you do and thanks for being here. Jen Rainin. Jen is the director. Hang on, let me get this exactly right. Jen is the director and co-producer of Ahead of the Curve. So congratulations to you on this enormous, amazing debut. Delighted to have you with us. Jen, your work in film is focused on building community, right? Deepening understanding of social justice issues, and of course, telling great stories. And this is possibly the greatest of them all. It is a hero story. It is legacy. It is history. It is all the things. And you really did an incredible job of bringing that across. So congrats and welcome. And finally, Franco Stevens, who, you know, just founded the most successful lesbian magazine ever and changed the course of history. So, you know, nothing to be too excited about there. Franco, delighted to have you with us. Thank you so very much for your work. It is a thrill, truly, to be moderating this panel with you here with us. I jest a little bit about changing the course of history, but you did. You changed it for many, many individuals. You created a presence and a platform for lesbian identity that simply did not exist before. And from that, so many other things and platforms and movements and identities, in fact, have been born. And so thank you very deeply from me personally and from the community for everything you've done. And we're going to get into it. We're going to have a good time tonight. I've got everybody set up with some questions, and we may or may not stick to the script because we know each other and we can go and do whatever we want. We've got about an hour to do that. Folks watching, please note that you are able, I believe, to enter questions in your using your screen, and those will be visible to me throughout the program. But what I'd like to do is hold for a Q&A at the end of this, about 15 minutes at the end of the conversation we're about to have, to jump into Q&A. So as we're going along, I encourage you to, and I'll prompt you again and again probably to put your questions up there so that you can also be involved in the conversation we're having. And I'll turn to those at the end of the conversation. So without further ado, let's get into it. And the first question, actually, I want to direct to Franco. And it's about this moment. You know, the film's coming out in a very, very different moment than the one in which you created the magazine. What feels right about that to you? Or how does that feel to you? How's it landing?
Well, it's always weird to have a movie made about you. You know,
is it?
It's very strange. It's like that first time you hear yourself on your own voicemail, you're like, I don't really sound like that, do I? But I guess I do. And, you know, I think the important thing is it's time that our movies get made. It's time that our stories are told. So often the stories that we hear and see have been about our gay brothers. And those are important, but, you know, we've been left out. And it's really time for our stories to be told. And I'm really grateful to Jen and Rivka for diving in and telling the story behind Curve Magazine.
Great. Yeah, Jen, tell me about that. You know, what did it take to get the film made? Like paddling fast underwater, looking fabulous on top? Is that how that works?
Right. While juggling a chainsaw and a ball. Yeah, no, it takes a boatload of badass women, fabulous queers, and an endless supply of matcha latte, apparently. So, but for real, like this was my first film, and I know film is like maybe the most collaborative of all the art forms. It really does take a village. It's still taking a village. We wouldn't have gotten it out there without the support and amazing feedback from all of our community, our family and friends, and our partners, and also a lot of matcha, a lot.
Yeah. And I'm assuming there was a lot of conversation between the two of you about how this story came together, because how could that be avoided?
Yeah.
What felt important as you were having those conversations? Like what really felt important to come across in the story?
Oh my gosh, so much. I think maybe the first thing that I realized is I so admire the way that Franco made her magazine. You know, she really she made it in community, made sure that we were telling our own stories, and representing our community, the beautiful diversity of our community, as best she could, and we wanted to do that as well. And so, you know, the film was made almost entirely by women, largely queer women and non-binary people, we very much followed the Franco footsteps.
The Franco footsteps. I love that. Franco, anything for you? What felt important?
Well, not so much about what felt important, but you know, when Jen came to me with the idea to make this movie, I was a little apprehensive. She said she got inspired by hearing me tell the stories about how the magazine started and some of the crazy antics that happened, you know, over the course of the years. And I thought, well, who's going to want to listen to that story? And
Who's not going to want to listen to it?
Exactly, turns out.
Well, it actually turned out that women want to hear those stories. People want to hear the stories, and that, in hindsight, like, I guess I had forgotten over the last little bit, like, that I'd really affected some people's lives in a positive way. And it's really, really humbling, but I didn't do it by myself. I mean, one thing that I loved that you did, Jen, was that you showed some of the old staff of Curve magazine and Danube magazine. And, without those women, I didn't do it by myself. Without those women, it never would have been. It's like, it seems like everything was the right time for that magazine to happen. It's like we needed the right editor came along. We needed the, graphic designer would just call me. We needed the money, I let the money fly on gambling. It's just like, if it's meant to be, it'll be. And it was meant to be.
Well, you say in the film, it felt like God was a lesbian. It sounds like God is a lesbian, the way this thing came together. So that's great. I mean, for me, the thing that really stood out in the making of the film and the way you told the story was the way you brought other voices into it. The magazine, you told a very authentic and transparent, and I felt accountable story about the way that you tried to bring voices and experiences into the magazine. And then in the making of the film, I saw the effort to do the same. And for me, that was really, really powerful as well. Kathy, Tamika, I'm curious if you all have a Curve story. I definitely have a Curve story. When did you discover the magazine? What did it mean to you? What's it like seeing it in a film? Any thoughts about that? Let's start with Tamika. Looks like you're muted. I'll have to unmute you.
Yeah, for sure. I think, first, thanks NCLR Mission Foundation for having me. I am fanning out a little bit with Jen, as a filmmaker, and then Franco. Just, I think the piece you said, like, it's so important that we give folks their roses when they're still here, to really accept and hear what an impact they made on folks. And if that takes a whole film, great. I mean, personally, I wanted to hear the story. It was hard for me when it ended. I stayed through the credits, saw the little piece at the end, and really was like, this could be a series. This could be something that we watch. And part of what I loved about it, I think you already spoke to it, Ruth, but the collectiveness of it, like, if this was about if this was about a white dude who started his tech company, because we've seen some of those documentaries coming up, it's about that dude, right? And it's about him and all he does that's magical or that messes up. But it's about him. And I thought that this really showed us the full team and, frankly, the full community that came together to make this magazine happen. And then I also thought it showed you, Franco, like, as a full person, right? And too often we're tied to what makes us successful and what are people going to know us for. And you showed yourself as a full person. And it wasn't just about, I'm going to be successful. It was about, I'm finding my place and I'm finding who I am, and I want others to have that same experience. And that, for me, is what the magazine did for me. I still remember in Omaha, Nebraska, where I grew up, and I thought there were no other gays. They finally opened this bookstore, and no one quite knew what the bookstore was. And I went in and I saw this magazine with beautiful women on the cover. And I was like, what's this? And I'm back home in my parents' house now, and I've been digging everywhere because I know I still have a stack that it didn't matter what issue it was, what month it was. There were those really dark days being Black and gay, being a genderqueer person in the Midwest, where I had to find that stack. I had to see what a lesbian looks like. I had to hear, the advice column about love. I had to believe that there could be a life of love for me. And when that small bookstore closed, I remember going to Barnes & Noble and being like, I know exactly what I'm looking for, and being scared that it said lesbian on the cover, but having a sense of pride that it said lesbian on the cover, and that it was a small way that I was being myself. And I think that oftentimes when you grow up in these, I live now in LA, Omaha is not LA. I live now with my wife and our 2 kids, and we have a very full life. And I have a ton of, I have a network, a community of queer people, and I didn't have that. And that was my community, books and this magazine. And frankly, I think you're right. The magazine was the one place where women took center stage and a lot of what I was seeing. And so to this day, I have my magazines and my trashy lesbian romance novels, and they get me through.
That's awesome. Same.
Makes me feel happy.
I was in the Midwest also. I was in a little town outside of Indianapolis, about 45 minutes, and I would drive to the Barnes & Noble in Indianapolis so that I could get, at the time, Deneuve, because that was one of my, that was my gateway drug. It was my way in. It was the portal, right? It was the magic portal. And so that was amazing. Kathy, how about you? What are your recollections?
Yeah. No, when I was in college in the late 90s, I ran this queer literary arts magazine. It was this glossy magazine that we wanted to be this beautiful publication, but it was just in our college. And that's when I discovered Curve. And I was like, oh my gosh, people actually do this and sell it, and it's in a store. And it was this incredible feeling of feeling like we weren't just doing something totally weird that no one had ever thought of, and that there was something out there for people to read already, and that was successful. And then, of course, it was also just really amazing for me. It was also when I was coming out, and just to see women, and so many different kinds of women, and all different ways of different professions and lifestyles, because I think, when you're coming out, and I also grew up in a rural area. I grew up in rural Hawaii and really didn't know anybody who was queer other than my older sister. And I just didn't know what options there were. Did you have to be a certain way? And one thing I really, really loved that you said in the film, Franco, was, not just that you have to be butch or wear the Doc Martens to be a lesbian, because my sister is butch, and I thought, oh no, I'm queer and now I have to look like that, and I don't know if I want to. And so it was just really great to see that, and I really just loved that you said that, because there's so many different ways to be lesbian, there's so many different ways to be queer, and it was really amazing to see that reflected in a magazine that was out there that everybody could see.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Really great.
I'm thinking
that
about...
was my goal.
That was your goal?
That was my goal, to show the inclusivity of our community, to show, how we are in every facet of our lives, to show, the older women, the younger women, the thick women, the thin women, the disabled, the able-bodied, the black, white, brown, really to be as inclusive as possible. And, I think as the magazine went on, it's something we always struggled with. Every time we had that column, Tamika was talking about, what does a lesbian look like? We really tried to break the mold so people could see themselves reflected back in the pages of their magazine, because that's what I always thought, it was their magazine, not my magazine, their magazine.
It's amazing. I mean, that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what happened. Kathy, I'm thinking about the photography you probably were doing right around the same time, right? And that you were working, the not so well kept secret that Kathy Sakamura is an amazing photographer, that you were also representing, I've seen your photos, representing women in love, couples, lesbians, and that need, that thirst you have for visibility, your own when you're coming out, and then as you've had that experience, the desire to create that for others, I think is super shared amongst lesbians.
Absolutely.
Jen, when you were thinking about, okay, so visibility is obviously going to be a central theme in this movie. How, and feel free to nerd out a little bit, how did you think about how to make that story happen in pictures and snippets and clips? How do you make sure that that's coming across? Because it's kind of a concept. It's more conceptual, right? The idea of visibility. How'd you make it happen? You definitely did on the screen.
Well, thanks. I mean, film is such a visual medium already. It's sort of set up to make that a little easier for us. We had part of the joy, I think, of telling this story is making it possible for the viewer to like transport back into the 90s, into that like spectacularly sexy, awesome, delicious San Francisco in the 90s dyke scene. And just so happened that in our garage was an enormous amount of footage that Frank saved mercifully from me. She's so the opposite of me. I would have been like, let's get rid of this, out, get everything out. So mercifully, she saved it and didn't let me throw anything away from the garage. So, weaving that into Franco's journey, in present day to understand, to meet with the community today and look at the leaders, young queer women today who are leading. It was a joy, and it was like putting a puzzle together, I would say. And I know, just thinking about visibility for our community, it was something we talked about constantly as we were conceptualizing and then making the film, because it was so much what Franco did with this magazine. So it was really important for us to include some of the early staff, like Deb St. John and Rachel Pepper, who told their stories about how they worked to make sure that the lesbian community was represented really beautifully in this gorgeous, glossy lifestyle magazine. Because, like Deb says in the film, until that time, we really weren't, first of all, we were barely represented at all. And when we were represented in media, it was almost always negative. It was always stereotypes. So visibility is such a potentially powerful tool to use it in the way that Franco used it, in the way that we're trying to do with the film. I think it has a sort of a two-pronged, a double-edged happy sword. Double-edged sword. Anyway, but one happy edge is that by making something like Curve Magazine or like this film, we have the opportunity to make ourselves more visible within community, to help the community come together and see ourselves reflected back in a healthy, positive way. It builds our self-confidence. It builds our sense of belonging. It sends a message that we are valid and we're beautiful. But also that other side of that happy sword is outside of community, right? Like making us visible. It's been so fun showing this film to people who are not either not queer or not female or non-binary identifying, to see like that. Just yesterday, actually, I showed it to a woman about 70 years old, straight white woman, who said she was so moved. She wrote me a letter afterward. She said, before this film, I thought that lesbian was just one of the ways you could have sex. She said, and that was it. She didn't think about it further than that. And she said, now, because I watched this film, now I understand that lesbian is actually a culture that is valuable and worth preserving and protecting. And I thought, oh my God, that's really powerful.
That's perfectly said. Yeah. Lesbian is actually a culture. I remember people saying stuff like that to me when I was a lot younger, and I didn't get it because I have multiple other cultures, right? And I was like, well, it's not a culture like, my Jamaican heritage is a culture, but it is now as I'm older and I have this tied all these, this depth of community experience. Absolutely. That's true. I want to reflect a little bit on kind of, again, the now of this film that's really backward looking. And there's an incredible question that I'm going to share because it frames up what I was going to ask about next really, really well. And the question or the comment really is, Franco, you mentioned you had some apprehension around telling this story, right? And the person asking the question, Camille, is curious if you ever thought about how different our community would be if you hadn't taken the risk to create the magazine and subsequently the film. And she reflects that at a time when our entire community was reeling from the impact of HIV/AIDS, Curve acknowledged the cumulative power of community building and empowerment. There's no queer storytelling or image making without Curve. And I love that. I think that's really, really beautiful and true. But it also grounds us in what was happening in our lives, in our community, when this magazine came out. And I'm wondering what you hear now as you're, in the world and this film is coming out. How are people reflecting on what's happening now in the world? We've had this huge pandemic. We've had the administration that we just had, right? This is another epic moment for our community. How does it compare? Like, you had this incredible moment when you made Curve that was just the gestalt of that time, and now we're in another one. What's that been like for you? Is it nostalgic? Does it relate, the two experiences?
Well, in reading back, looking back at that question that she wrote, it's kind of intense for me to read that. Like, what would it be like if Curve never existed? And right. I think I've been so, my mindset has been so Curve and Deneuve since I was, early 20s. So the majority of my life has been, kind of focused on that. So I'm almost too close to answer that question. Mm-hmm. So maybe I'd love to hear what the other women on the panel think about that question. But the one thing I did want to mention is that you're right. During the time where I was founding the magazine, it seemed like the lesbian community was really stepping up to take care of our brothers that were just so impacted by HIV/AIDS at the time. We put everything down because our community needed us. And, I was kind of hoping that the men would see what we did for them and step up for us as well, but I'm not so sure that that's happened. Anyway, back to the original question. I want to hear what you all have to say.
Tamika, Kathy, what would it have been like if we had not had Curve magazine?
I mean, I think there are the larger community impacts, and I think the film does a really good job of highlighting some of those. But I go back to the personal impacts, right? For me, you and Kathy in our small communities, there were some dark days, and I think the part of the movie where I got a little emotional is this idea of being outed by someone else before you're ready, before you get to have that moment back. And then that relationship of unconditional love one, has with their mother, theoretically. And I remember in my own coming out story, we're in a great place now, but there was a time where that wasn't the case, where I felt just as isolated and cast aside. And I think that we have a generation of folks who have been enriched, who have found value in their stories, who have found value in themselves, right? It wasn't just that this was a lesbian magazine. It was that there was somebody who looked like me who was worthy of being a cover girl. And to be a cover girl, she could wear lipstick in a fabulous dress, or she could wear a dope suit and have like the flyest, close cut haircut. And so I think, yes, there's that, but I think, sometimes I wonder, would I be here, right? I think so often we think about civil rights movements and we think about court cases and we think about, these major events that happen that get on the news, but storytelling, arts, having someone voice for you that you are not alone, it literally saves lives. And I don't think that's an overstatement. I'm not trying to be, overly emotional, but it's pride. And I think sometimes we get so caught up in the celebration of where we are that we don't recognize where we came from. And frankly, we don't realize that last year was the deadliest year for queer folks, particularly trans folks, particularly trans folks of color, particularly trans women of color. And so I think that, you know, those stories need to be told. And I think that is life-saving. It is life-changing, but it is also life-saving, because when you feel completely isolated, and you know, I said this before, but it's not just that I'm reading this advice column on romance because I want to know what to do with my non-existent partner because I don't think anyone else is gay where I live. It's because the fact that people are asking for advice means they've had a relationship, means that is possible. Storytelling allows us to imagine futures for ourselves that oftentimes we're surrounded by people telling us we're not worthy of and we will never get. And I think that is, again, absolutely life-saving.
Absolutely. So true. So true. Yeah. Kathy, I want to talk a little bit about NCLR with you, if that's okay. Just pivot a little bit into something else here, because one of the things that it means so much to me is that in moving from NCLR to Ms., I've been able to continue work under the big umbrella of feminism. And both Ms. and Curve were, as Amani sort of referenced, the magazines were begun because in both cases, there were communities looking for visibility, looking for representation and something substantial and real. And Ms. Foundation and NCLR founded as well because we needed to make sure that we were resourcing movements that were otherwise being overlooked. But as we look now across the decades, there have been lots and lots of ways that the issue of visibility, the issue of representation has shaped NCLR and shaped the work at NCLR. Can you speak a little bit to some of that?
Absolutely. And I think it's really lovely to think about the parallels with, you know, Curve and its development and all that it did and how NCLR has developed over time as well. And thinking about how we approach community work and changing the world through lesbian feminism. And that encompasses a really broad intersectional idea of what it means to be a contributing and positive member of all of our communities. I think, like Franco said, lesbians cared for gay men during the height of the AIDS crisis, and lesbians continue to care for many, many people who have all kinds of needs in all kinds of areas. If you go into any service sector, in terms of service of people who are in need, domestic violence shelters, legal aid, lesbians are vastly overrepresented in all of those areas. And I think that there is a connection between lesbian community and serving all communities, not just lesbians, and thinking about that more broadly. I think that's really also the trajectory of NCLR. We started in the 70s because women were coming out and losing custody of their children, and nobody was talking about that or trying to help them. And there was this tremendous need that women had to just try to have some ability to continue the relationship that they had with their children. But it quickly moved to focusing on all issues that LGBTQ people face in that same way, trying to think broadly about how we also can serve all segments of the community, of our communities, and especially the segments of the communities that are not being talked about more broadly and thought about more broadly. I think NCLR also very early on started a transgender project and thinking about and talking about transgender rights as being a part of our work, and the same way that, you know, Curve did as well. And I think just really that approach to work through communities that aren't just about the people who are like us, both about our own visibility, but also everyone who is in need of relief from oppression. And that is, I think, part of what it means to be a lesbian and to have a lesbian feminist approach. And I think that that's a really, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, you know, working at the National Center for Lesbian Rights and explaining that we don't just work for lesbians. You know, we work for everyone. And our vision is a world where every single person lives free from oppression and discrimination. And it's not possible for anyone, and it's not possible for lesbians to live freely if everyone doesn't live freely, that we're all connected. And I think that's a really lovely way of thinking about this work and thinking about what it means to be a lesbian.
Absolutely. I think those connections are prevalent across the board, like in this across this panel, in everybody's work. And Tamika, I know for sure they come up in yours. As you're working at this really interesting intersection of nonprofit leadership, racial justice, diversity and inclusion, transportation and access in urban settings, to be really specific. You're probably seeing a lot of these issues of visibility and access and power emerging in different ways. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think so much of it is, and a lot of my work is, and not just transportation, but built environment. So urban planning, and how does that intersect? And the way I like to talk about it is, how do we take up space, right? And how do we take, how do we own what is our public space? And I think, whether or not you're talking about Stonewall, or a lot of folks who are a little East Coast centric like to forget about Compton's cafeteria in San Francisco. So whether or not you're talking about these movements where queer folks, and often it's women and trans folks and folks of color, not just, I think, the queer white men that many people think of, but it's those folks taking up public space and saying, no, we have a right to be here. And just like, nowadays you're seeing people say, well, I could support Black Lives Matter, but it's just a bunch of rioters. We know that they started off saying our community, the queer community, were a bunch of rioters. But really, it's about taking up space. And I think something Amani said earlier, and something that, NCLR has been particularly thoughtful about, both under Kate and now under Amani, and really the whole staff, is this idea of intersectionality. And I think that sometimes as a queer Black person, right, you feel too Black for the gay spaces, and you feel too gay for the Black spaces. And so much of how we think about the work we do and who we are as people is, how do we take up space? And I think what so many people fail to realize, and especially in our, gay community, LGBTQ, IA plus, however you want to describe it, I think we got into this phase of talking about safe spaces. And the reality is, for many of us, there's no safe space, right? It's just, are we brave enough to be our authentic selves? And I think throughout this whole film, you saw somebody who was like, I'm going to be brave enough, and I'm going to be brave enough to take on the unknown. And that's really how we move forward, not just from seeking these places where we can be safe or where we can be comfortable, but acknowledging that for so many of us, it's just about being brave and being our authentic selves, and seeing ourselves reflected and hearing those stories helps. But it's also a lot of individuals. And so, as I think about this work, I always challenge people, how can we think about how we take space? And for those who have the privilege to not have to think about these things and are probably taking up a lot of space without realizing it, how can they cede some of that space? And how can they acknowledge these experiences that are different than theirs, and let some of that go, and let the rest of us just be us, not be just like you? Because I don't want to be just like you. I don't want you to say you're colorblind. I want you to see that I'm Black. I don't want you to say you have a wife and kids. You're just like me. Like, well, fine, but I'm not actually trying to assimilate. I'm trying to be my best self, my most authentic self. And I want that to be valued too. I don't want you to just like me because I'm like you. I want you to like me because you see that I am authentically taking the space that as we just heard Franco say and Kathy say, that our ancestors have worked hard to get, and that we very much deserve. And that's whether or not I'm at a Pride event, or whether or not I'm at a Black Lives Matter event. And I should be able to be my full self at either of those places.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Franco, was there a moment where you felt that flip of the switch, where you're like, no, hell no, I'm not going anywhere. I'm here. I'm going to take up some space. When did that happen for you? Because we saw that story. We saw the exit from your home and how it was that you came to be, at different light and so forth. When did that bravery kind of rear up inside of you?
I think it was from working at a different light. It's like I saw the other workers there. The staff, they were so artistic, and they were creating zines, and you know, doing drag and, you know, marching in the streets and laying down in the streets. And I thought, I don't belong here. And then after a while, I was like, you know what? I belong here, and I need to start taking up my own space. And I need to not just complain that somebody should be doing this magazine, you know, because if you do nothing but complain, nothing's going to get done. So why shouldn't it be me? You know, maybe somebody's listening to this, and why shouldn't it be them? You know, nowadays we have such a great gift of the internet to be able to reach so many people. I mean, back then, you could be, Tamika, you could be, you know, in Omaha and not know that there was another gay person a mile down the road because you had no way of connecting with them. The internet has given our community such a voice to be able to express who we are and reach others that are like us, that, you know, my greatest wish is that somebody sees this movie and says, you know what, I can do that. I can make the change that I want to see. I can risk everything to live my authentic self. If they can even just think that they might want to do that, then, you know, I can die a happy woman. Hopefully not for many years, but, you know, it would just be the greatest gift to me. You know, Denise Frohman in the movie says something about, you know, having cracked open a door so that others might follow through it a little bit easier. And that just struck such a chord with me. Like, if I could help somebody, you know, idealize their dream, what greater gift could there be than that?
Absolutely. As you're talking, I'm looking at these faces. I'm looking at the four of you and thinking, well, yeah, Franco, you've done this amazing thing. You started this historic magazine. But Kathy, you've done extraordinary things at NCLR. Tamika, you've founded a consulting firm, and I know the work you're doing is changing the world. And Jen, you made this movie. So each of you have had that moment where you had to kind of confront your own dream, your own vision, and decide, yeah, it's go time. I'm going to put this in drive and go. And I'm curious about what it was like for the rest of you. So Kathy, what was that? What's it been like? Like, you came to NCLR really early in your legal career. When did you realize that the thing you were building was going to have the kind of significance that it does today?
Oh gosh, that's such a great question. And I think, you know, how interesting it is that you can pursue your dream and make a big change regardless of like what your base personality is. So like, it was really amazing to watch you, Franco, be like, I'm just gonna take out all the credit cards and I'm gonna play the horses. And I'm like, oh my God, that's like the last thing I would have done. I had a plan and I solidly pursued it for many years. But yeah, I think it's so interesting how I came to this work. I think I got inspired by a lot of people who did related work. I never thought I would be a lawyer. I thought the lawyers were like either your divorce lawyer or like a corporate lawyer. I never thought lawyers could change the world until I took this class in college, and I was like, wow, lawyers can change the world. And, you know, and then I met somebody from NCLR and I was like, oh my gosh, you could change the world for LGBTQ people through the law. And, you know, I think it was just these pieces that led me to where I came to. And I had this incredible opportunity to start the project that was focused on poverty, LGBTQ families living in poverty and their legal needs at NCLR. And it was just this amazing moment that at that time felt like the culmination of many years. But it was actually just this total beginning where then I got here and I was like, how do we get people to talk about poverty? It's like really hard. I think there was though a moment several years in when I realized that other people were really talking about the work that I had tried so hard to get other people to talk about. When I started seeing things in like LGBT news and from other organizations talking about poverty in the community, and that was an LGBTQ issue, and talking to people doing poverty work, how they were recognizing that so many of their clients were LGBTQ, but not really talking about with them, and that they needed to focus on LGBTQ issues too. And that really felt like an amazing moment. Plus, of course, just the amazing clients and incredible cases I've had over the years. But I was reflecting on how one time I didn't realize this was going to happen, but Curve wrote an article about one of my cases kind of early on. And I was just like, where is that? I have it somewhere. And I was like, I am in Curve magazine for my legal work for LGBTQ families, and I have made it.
It was a definite marker of success, yes, for our generation. You got into Curve. Absolutely. Jen, it's taken, we've got to see the kind of grit it took for Franco to make Curve, but it's taken grit for you to make this film. And you were talking before we got on the panel here about it being a masterclass. Was there a moment for you where you were like, okay, this is happening. I'm going to make it happen. Rivka and I were in it. We're going to win it. What was that moment like for you?
So I've had about 1,000 of those moments. But the early, I mean, Frank has heard me tell this story a few times, quite more than a few times. Her story is just such a great story. And I have always wanted to make a narrative film, a fiction film. I always just thought that would be the most exciting, fun challenge. And so there was a moment that it hit me that, oh my goodness, Franco's story would make such a great fiction film. I should totally write the screenplay for this. So I started writing it and researching for it. And in the research, I realized, whoa, where's the source material? Where are the stories about queer women from the 90s and 80s? I couldn't find, I guess actually now that I'm saying it, I'm like, oh my God, it's just like what Frank did with the magazine. Where I was like, we need our nonfictions, like we need our history told. Like right. Most of Frank said this earlier, most of the stories that are out there about our history are about men, about gay men. Queer women's stories aren't told very well or very often. And it just became really clear there was an imperative for me to tell this as a nonfiction story. And that was it for me. I was like, all right, I'm in, done. That was the moment. And I just started and I just broke it into little pieces. I'm like, I can do this one piece. And I got that piece done. I'll do the next piece. And it turns out that the pieces just keep they keep coming.
Right. And they build. They build.
Yeah, they do.
Absolutely. I mean, the film definitely brings that across, that there were pieces in place and there was a vision you had, Franco, and then there was more, and then your mailbox was overflowing, and then, and then there was more and more, and then you had staff on the phone with people, and you were realizing that this was more than a magazine. It's an incredible, incredible story. And you're right. We do have to tell our history. We also have to change our laws. Right. And one of the big things that's happened since the beginning of Curve, obviously, one of the biggest laws that changed was the law around same-sex marriage. But now I know NCLR is working on the Equality Act as well, and getting that passed. And Kathy and Tamika, I think it'd be really interesting to hear what you think about this. Do you think that if the Equality Act is passed, what is it going to change? I mean, obviously it's going to change. It will get us a lot, but what specifically will it change for our community? And maybe what might not be changed I'm also curious about that. Kathy, I want to start with you and then go to Tamika, if that's okay.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, our whole existence, we have lived without broad protections legally for being able to live our lives and be LGBTQ people, that, we've gotten a lot of gains in the last couple of decades, so many. But still, there's nothing that says in federal law that people can't fire you or, deny you housing. And, now we do with Bostock in terms of its interpretation, which is an incredible advancement. But there is a power in having a written law that mentions you and honors your identity as being worthy of protection. And that, I think, would have a tremendous impact on how people actually get to move through the world throughout the country. And, I think that's why passing the Equality Act is so important to us to really be able to achieve that after so many decades of struggling through local ordinances and state by state protections. And as a person who does state law work for LGBTQ people, 51 jurisdictions is a lot. And we're never going to get full protections for every person in every state through state action alone. And that kind of federal recognition of our identities and the need for protection is so important to advancing that. At the same time, I think we all know that a law on paper alone isn't going to protect the community. And that we have to also have societal change, to have visibility, to have people interested in implementing that law and ensuring that the courts are recognizing the strength of that law, that employers and people providing housing are recognizing the need to provide equal services. I mean, all of those things have to go hand in hand. That to really have lived equality and justice, we have to both have written, clear laws that recognize our identities as being worthy parts of our society and societal change at the same time. And so I think really it is just a piece, but it's a really important piece, because if we don't have that kind of recognition at a broad federal level, there's always an argument that it's not as important to think about these issues.
Absolutely. Tamika, what do you think about that? And what are the mechanisms for going beyond the law, as Kathy said?
Yeah, so I think Kathy's spot on. I think sometimes people feel like laws don't matter, but you have some lawyers on this panel, and so we know how big that federal law could be. Also, I remember being at Stanford Law School, sitting in our little law school cafe at a table with the other Black women in my class, because there were only a few of us, so we could all fit at one table, and crying tears of joy when Obama was elected. And then moving over to the table with the 3 other gay kids in my class, because there were only 4 of us at the time, and crying about Prop 8, right? And so we know that when these official government entities try to define who we are or what is worthy, it impacts us. And so for me, I think everything Kathy said is spot on. But the thing I also want to focus, and I try to say a lot to folks when I speak, is, sometimes you hear panels like this with a bunch of badass, inspiring women, and you're like, well, I'm just going to go out there and I'm going to do all the things. And you can and you should. But this is also a long fight. So as Kathy said, even once we pass these laws, we have to make sure they're being implemented. And we know that there are going to have to be court cases where people say this is the law and you broke it. And so we don't always have to set ourselves on fire to keep other people warm. This is a long fight. And so sometimes the right thing is taking care of yourself. Sometimes it's today is not the day I'm going to set the world on fire. I'm going to take a nap. And that's going to be tomorrow, right? And so I think one of the things we need to do to keep our movement going forward is we have to realize that people are going to make the change. And so we need you. We need you to do that audacious thing that nobody thinks you can do. And we also need to acknowledge that just because we've come so far, and just because we all know the beauty and joy of being a gay woman, like the joy I feel when I kiss my wife is unparalleled, right? I don't know what it would be like to kiss a man. I don't want to. I love it, right? And I think as much as we know that, there are still times when it's hard. There are still times where we know we're being treated differently. We just bought a house, and we know that as soon as we walked in and she saw this interracial lesbian couple, all of a sudden things changed. And we were told explicitly, this person doesn't want to sell you their house. They think there's a better buyer and a better family for their house, right? And is that because I'm Black? Is it because my wife is white? Is it because we're queer? All of these things go through our head. And so we have to take care of ourselves. And I've never been a person that's like, we have to change hearts, but we have to do all of those things, right? We have to change hearts, we have to change laws, and then we have to keep pushing. We just have to keep pushing, because we can't you know, for me, my liberation is not tied to white people. I can't wait for white people to decide I'm worthy. I know it's going to take me. I can't wait for straight people to decide that I'm worthy. And so we need the Francos, we need the Kathys, we need the Amanis, the Kate Kindles, right? We need them to lead us. And we need to start saying, you know what, you can come or not, but this is where we're going. Because I believe in women to get us there. I believe in queer women to get us there. I definitely believe in queer women of color to get us there. And so we just have to keep pushing in every aspect of our lives and take naps.
And take naps. I love it. Definitely take naps. So we're going to move into Q&A, and we've got a couple really interesting ones that I think we can chew on for a bit here. We've got about 15 minutes for the Q&A portion. So if you haven't had a chance to put your question in the chat, please do it. But I'm going to start out here because it kind of takes us from where we were just now. With this question, so many of the conversations that we're still having today, especially around identity and LGBTQ rights, were happening in between those early Deneuve and Curve covers. And these issues were then picked up by mainstream media. First off, this is for you, Franco. Were you surprised when you saw this, would see this happen? And for Tamika, Kathy, and Jen, where do you see the most pressing conversations that are shaping the queer space taking place today? So Franco, first of all, were you surprised about this? Were you surprised when you saw this conversation about identity happening in the covers, in between the covers of your magazine, and then jumping off into mainstream media?
I was definitely surprised. Like, you know, one of the things that I thought about our visibility is, as minority women, we would be more supportive of each other. But when we would put, you look at the first couple of years of the magazine, and you'll notice we had a woman over 60. We have young women, Black women, white women. But the issues with white women in their 30s always sold the best, which made me kind of angry. It's like, shouldn't we be better than that? So to show the diversity always meant like, well, we're going to show this regardless of how it impacts our sales. But it was always a little disheartening to me, because I thought we should be able to show the diversity within our community and not have our own people not subscribe to what we're doing. That was always a little bit hard. One thing you say about, having the mainstream pick up the conversations of our identity, it's a really weird thing. It's like the young people, maybe their first introduction is not through a magazine like Curve today, but maybe through more mainstream media. But nobody can tell our stories like we tell our stories. When I was growing up, I didn't even know women could be lesbians. Like, it didn't even dawn on me. And that's what I think is a huge difference between how we are today and how we were 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. It's like, because of mainstream media and the advances we've made, girls that are like 10, 11, and 12 can be like, yeah, I'm trans, or yes, I'm fluid, or yes, I'm a lesbian. And they just say it like nonchalant, like it is not this thing that, that some of us who are older really struggled and will our parents disown us, and, will we lose our jobs? In that case, it does feel like, media in general has helped our cause, but also young people not having to hide, I guess, has really made a big change in our own identity, I think.
Yeah. Jen, any thoughts at like most pressing conversations now? What are the most what do you think are some of the most pressing conversations happening and shaping really queer identity now?
I mean, I just listening to everything Franco was just saying, I'm thinking about some of the young queer people that we met while making the film. And, we showed in one of the stories that they told when we met with them in the film, a young girl, probably 19 years old, said, look, when I came out to my mom, she actually said, if I had known you were gay, I would have aborted you. Like, that is still happening.
Yeah.
So yeah, we've made a lot of progress. And yes, mainstream media has certainly helped. And absolutely, there are a lot more people who are feeling confident and comfortable to be out and to live their authentic lives. But it is by no means everyone. So there is still an enormous amount of work to do. I mean, that's
the truth.
That's heavy,
Yeah, that's the truth.
And in terms of like, what do I think are the kind of the most cutting edge or whatever, what are the biggest, most important conversations happening in community? I mean, I think continuing to explore and talk with each other about how we identify, and acknowledging that the way I identify does not take anything away from the way that you identify. In fact, it friggin' adds to it. Makes it a better and more interesting world and a more interesting and rich experience for everyone. Having those conversations feels really important still, because there's a lot of, like, I think, and having them intergenerationally as well, making sure that we bring in younger folks and more seasoned folks to to talk, to hear each other, to really hear each other. Because I think that when we're not talking to each other, we make assumptions. And I know, as when we started making the film, I made the assumption that young women are not using the word lesbian, that was passé, and that felt terrible. And then it turns out that's not actually universally the case. Yeah, there are some younger folks who are not using it, but a lot of young women are reclaiming the word.
Right.
I don't know. I could talk for another 40 minutes on this topic, but yeah, it feels important. It feels important for us to be in conversation with each other about our identities.
Yeah. Tamika, important conversations. What conversations are you feeling are most important to be having right now?
I mean, I think that piece about identity is huge. And I think as our community continues to evolve and change and the umbrella continues to grow, both in terms and in colors, I think that's a really important conversation. But for me as a Black person, it's race. I think we have to talk about race. We're out here dying. And I love that I have the right to be married, and I would love to have the right to not be discriminated against at work just because of who I love or how I identify. But at the end of the day, I feel like I can't breathe. I feel like I can't eat Skittles. I feel like I can't walk. I feel like I can't run. I feel like I can't do anything without the fear of death. And I think that as much as I believe that being queer isn't as easy as popular culture would make us believe, and it hasn't been completely accepted, it has still, in some ways, I still feel safer as a queer woman than I ever will as a Black person, particularly a Black gender nonconforming person that many people see as a young Black man. And I think those are conversations we absolutely have to have in our queer community. And I think, we saw it back then, as Franco said, what magazine sold, and we see it today. And if we can't talk about the fact that we have to stop the killing of Black people, then those aren't spaces that I feel like are as welcoming and bold and inclusive as we like to think they are.
Right. And that's a conversation that in your body is one and the same with the conversation about your queerness or your being a lesbian.
Absolutely. Right? They're not these separate categories where I can show up and say, today I can talk about this and today I can talk about this. We have to start realizing that and I love that the film said this. Black issues are gay issues. Disability issues are gay issues, right? And I don't think that a lot of folks still are able to say that confidently. And I think it was important that the film highlighted that. I think it's important that Curve highlighted that many years ago, and folks still haven't figured it out. So we have to keep talking about it.
Yeah. Kathy, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, these are all so important, and I think there's so many actually that come to mind, but I want to talk about two things that I think have been so much on my mind in the work I'm doing right now. And first is thinking about the child welfare system and how the child welfare system separates, regulates, and harms, especially Black and Brown families, and that actually it is vastly disproportionately separating, especially Black LGBT parents from their children. And that's a flip side or a companion to the way the criminal justice system works. And that I think there's been so much attention on discrimination against LGBT adoptive and foster parents, and not really enough about how lots and lots of LGBT parents, and especially LGBT parents of color, are wrongfully losing custody of their children to the system. Not the work not just in custody cases against another parent or a family member, but that the state is forcibly separating families. And lots of the children who are out there to be fostered and adopted really could safely be with their families of origin if we approached the child welfare system differently, and if we supported families to stay together rather than focusing on paying for foster and adoption. And I think that's such an important part of this conversation of transformation of systems that harm us and our families, is to think about how that operates. And the second one, I think, is just so of the moment that we've been talking about a lot, is, of course, just the horrible attacks on transgender children. We've been doing work for decades now on issues that young transgender and gender nonconforming children face. And we first struggled to get anybody to even think about or have a realization that there are transgender children and that there aren't just transgender adults. And we made some progress, and now we're in this tremendous moment of backlash. And I think it is particularly because there is this, I think, terrifying coalition of, the right wing and some people who identify as lesbians denying the existence and the worthiness and the dignity of transgender people, that as cisgender, lesbian, queer, and bisexual women, we have an obligation to show what it means to be lesbian, what it means to be a queer woman isn't that we do support and embrace all identities, and that all of our transgender community members are part of our community and worthy of being able to live their authentic selves, and that we have to step up and talk about how important it is to support transgender people as cisgender women.
Absolutely. I love that. And it touches on, there's a question here about image making for lesbians and our identities kind of as we see them reflected increasingly in the media. How do we find our own space? And the question puts me in mind of another one that wasn't asked here, but is often asked. Lesbians aren't visible. We're invisible. We're going to become more invisible as more and more members of our community and more identities emerge, possibly, and there's a line and there's scarcity and all of that. But I think this question about what will it look like as we move forward, and as mass media and the options available to us in terms of media are reflecting back so many different versions of ourselves, and possibly maybe less uniqueness across those versions, a more sanitized, Franco, you said the magazines that were picked up the most, that were bought the most, were the ones that reflected the lives of 30 somethings who were white. And so maybe this question could go to you. What do you think is going to happen, and how can we maintain the identity and the uniqueness we had when we were fighting so hard from the outside, right? In a moment that is increasingly embracing of our identity? What happens as we're increasingly embraced?
That is an excellent question. And not that it's off topic, but, in the movie, you see the arc of how Curve has changed over the years and whether it will continue in the future. And Jen and I have created the Curve Foundation to further the mission of the magazine. And thank you. And, you know, I really see that foundation as really something to look forward to. And Jen, I know you speak about it a lot more eloquently than I do. So maybe you can touch on that.
Oh, I don't know about that. Hey, before I do, I want to just say, Ruth, the lighting on your face is so cool right now.
I was hoping this wouldn't happen actually, but yes, the sun is now in my eyes and I'm doing this. Thank you.
Yeah, well, so, you know, I think one of the biggest gifts that came out of making this film and doing this work alongside Franco was as getting a better sense of what the community needs today. And we have this spectacular honor and good fortune to have been able to launch the Curve Foundation. We have a brand new executive director in Jasmine Sudarkasa, who's, oh man, you're going to start seeing her pop up on the scene a lot. She is quite spectacular. And we have two initial programs that we're starting. One is in partnership with NLGJ, the Association of Queer Journalists, and it's the Curve Award for Emerging Journalists. So we're building cohorts of early career journalists who are interested in telling our stories, lifting up our stories, continuing in the tradition of Curve magazine. And the other big program that we have launched, which is going to take a little while to complete, but I'm very excited about, is we're making a searchable, accessible archive out of the 30 years of Deneuve and Curve magazine articles. It's such a funny thing now. If you can't find something when you Google search, it's kind of like it never happened. And it's just making that 30 years of effort that Franco and her team put into making sure that we are invisible. So we're bringing that into the light, much like Ruth is bringing herself fully into the light here in front of our eyes.
Thank you so much for that answer. Honestly, I think we should end there, frankly, because this is about stewarding the legacy of Curve, and Curve Foundation is going to be a big part of stewarding that legacy. I'm so excited that you all did that, and I'm so excited about what that's going to bring to us. And I think if we steward the legacy well, each of us in our work and each of you out there, what we can hope for is that increasingly more of our identities are visible, and more of the identities across our community are visible, and that we can live safe lives in the light. So thank you all very, very much. And thanks for everybody that gave us their thoughtful questions. They've added much to this conversation. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you so much.